I just wanted to tell you that my email addresses, both private and professional, are on this first slide, will be on the last slide. So if you have any questions at all or comments or advice at the end of this, then please don't hesitate to drop me a line. Could you move to the next slide, please, Wayne? Thank you. So we're going to jump in a very short introduction. I'm probably going to tell you all everything that you already know, but please bear with me. So this is a balloon view of the grounds of the 1876 Philadelphia World's Fair. If you look to kind of the center right, you'll see these enormous machinery halls. Now those are 13 acres of technological innovations. There were 37 participating nations at this fair, and you could visit and you could take a look at the most innovative technology at the time. So you could take a look at Edison's automatic telegraph system, for example, Corliss's steam engine, Bell's telephone. If you were at the fair, you could spend 50 cents and have a letter written on a state-of-the-art machine called a typewriter. You could try out a Singer's sewing machine. And it was also here that Americans, for the first time, had their taste of bananas and Heinz ketchup. And if you would move to the next slide, the Waltham Watch Company had a stand at this fair. And you know, you could walk around the grounds of this fair, and there were actually workers from the Waltham Watch Company that would sit on the row of chairs that you see before you. And it's not quite sure what part they were assembling, but in any case, you could see these watchmakers assemble these different pieces kind of live, if you will. So that was exciting. And if you would move to the next slide, you'd see that within the crowd that were actually taking in all this spectacle, well, there stood Jacques David, this mustachioed Swiss man. He is a very important figure in Swiss watchmaking because he was the chief engineer at Les Longines. So Les Longines is located in kind of northwestern Switzerland, up in the mountains. And since its founding in 1860, Les Longines had established itself as the global leader of timepiece production. But by 1876, Les Longines was experiencing really terribly declining sales in the US. And that was exactly because of the Waltham Watch Company's extraordinary success. The Swiss exports to the US, their primary market, had dropped by more than 2/3 over the past 5 years at the time of the World's Fair. And the Swiss watchmaking industry at this time was facing nothing short of an existential crisis. And it was, I mean, I cannot stress how worried the Swiss watchmakers were at the time of the World's Fair. They were up in their mountains in the Bernese Jura, like I said, in northwestern Switzerland, and they were all in conference together. They were speaking to each other saying, well, there's this rival called the Waltham Watch Factory, and they're making so many watches, and the watches are good, and the watches are attractive, and they're cheap. And how do they even manage to do it? And if they keep on doing it, then we're in trouble because we're going out of business. And that's precisely why Jacques David and these other Swiss delegates were sent to the World's Fair to do a little industrial kind of spying, if you will, espionage, if you will, because they just had to figure out what is it that this Waltham Watch Company was doing? What is it that made them tick? And as David put it, you know, to reiterate how worried he was, he had said in 1876, "It is obvious to all that at this time, the American factory has the advantage. Their products are wanted everywhere. They manufacture, they sell, while the Swiss factory is idle and its agents are without business with many unsold goods." So until, you know, you have to understand that until Waltham Watch had busted onto the scene, you know, watchmaking was majoritarily undertaken in Switzerland at the time, and it was a cottage industry. So there were various parts of the watch that were manufactured by hand. A lot of the times, most of the time in the context of very small ateliers in Switzerland, small workshops that were seconded, that were helped by, domestic work done by mostly farmers and agricultors who had time in the winter months. So you would have a family of agricultors in the summer who would work the land. They were also working pasture. And during the winter, when there was very heavy snowfall in Switzerland, then they would retreat to the indoors. And during the winter times, the children, the wife, everyone basically in certain villages would be working at piecework, at watchmaking piecework. And the big disruptor was Aaron Dennison, and by 1850, when he founded this Waltham Watch Factory, he had already studied mechanical engineering at the Springfield Armory, and that's when he understood that he could apply this kind of making interchangeable parts on the cheap. He could apply that to the art of watchmaking and therefore create a very vast amount of watches in very little time. If you would show us the next slide, please. This is just another aerial view of the factory circa 2015. I'm sure you all know this. I think it's been kind of converted to lofts and apartment buildings and a business center, I believe. I just always love kind of showing this because I just think that it's just such a beautiful, wonderful structure. And all my colleagues and friends in Switzerland too. I mean, we're all so surprised at how very big it is compared to what we're used to seeing in Switzerland. So if you would please give us the next slide. So that's kind of my very basic introduction of who is the Waltham Watch Company and why were the Swiss so afraid. And now I'm just kind of going to turn to the history side for the moment. So I'm going to put my historian's cap on and just kind of remind you that so this orological history, the history of watchmaking, has enjoyed systematic analysis, mostly as of the 20th century. And historians have focused their research on exceptional watches and makers and companies. And the focus is often either on a single object or a single person. Pierre-Yves Donzé, for example, has written very extensively about the Swiss watchmaking industry. Amy Glassmeyer takes a more global approach, so does Lanz. Cipolla, the first book, is kind of more focused on, well, it's also kind of an early attempt at a global history. But what I'm trying to say is that, all of these books are wonderful, and if you have an interest in orological history, I certainly recommend them. But in all of these, there are people, events that have been overlooked, obviously, and it's interesting in exploring, especially these overlooked events and people, to have us better understand how science and technology, the changes are made possible. So we actually concern ourselves with the social history of watchmakers. And what does that mean? That means that we're going to go take a look at the subaltern protagonists that have escaped analysis. We have a special focus on women, but obviously, you can't only look at the women, we also look at the men. Can we have the next slide, please? And so what do I mean by subaltern protagonists? Well, basically what I mean is not these fellows. Now, these fellows are very foundational figures in our orological history. From left to right, you have Daniel Jean Richard, the Swiss, who's credited with being the father of Swiss watchmaking. To his right, Aaron Dennison, of course, of the Waltham Watch Factory. Next to Aaron Dennison, you have Kintori Hattori. I believe that his watchmaking concern was Seiko. He founded Seiko in Japan. And when he did so, I believe it was second half of the 19th century. And when he did so, he actually was very, very strongly inspired by Aaron Dennison's work. So that's quite interesting, actually, to see how horology went from Switzerland to the United States and then to Japan, to the other side of the world. And then another foundational figure of horology, we would be remiss if we didn't mention Nicola Hayek. And to all those who know recent history of watchmaking, he was a Lebanese-born Swiss businessman, and he had managed the Swiss Swatch Group during a very grave crisis that had happened during the 1970s, so quite recently. And the crisis actually came about because the Japanese started mass producing quartz watches that were so cheap and so accurate. You know the story. But anyways, you know, when you look at the history of watchmaking, you kind of think of these kind of figures. And as important as they are, absolutely, I think it's also extraordinarily interesting and important to look at the workers in factories, you know, the subaltern protagonists, and try to uncover some stories about their labor, about their lives. Yes, Wayne, please, the next slide, thank you. And to give you an idea, I don't only look at women watchmakers at Waltham. I'm also very interested in women watchmakers, you know, abroad as well. This is a very, very special piece. So John Platt is a real fanatic of horological history, and he happens to be a very good friend, a very lovely fellow. He's based in the UK, near Newcastle upon Tyne, and he's a collector. He has well over 500 pieces, I think, of especially British watches. He's especially interested in watches that were created around Liverpool. And this is a very special piece of his because it's signed by a woman, Elizabeth Beasley. Now, we don't know a lot about Elizabeth Beasley. We do, so according to John, he thinks that this piece, this movement, so this is the interior mechanism of a watch, you're seeing the backside, this would have been created somewhere between, I think he said 1770 and 1810. And apparently it was manufactured in Prescott, which is in central England, and it was a real hub of watchmaking in England. And what's really interesting is that it's the only piece that he has that was signed by a woman. And when, according to John, when the piece is signed in this way, according to him, he believes that Elizabeth Beasley had actually produced the entire watch. So she wasn't necessarily the manager of the concern, say the owner of the business that created the watch, but she was the actual artisan, the actual person, the mechanic, if you will, that fabricated each piece and that assembled each piece. So this is a really special piece in horological history. We don't have a lot of timepieces from this period that are signed by women, but it is really an extraordinary find. If I could have the next slide, please. Also, during my research, well, I've asked myself, well, what about the other Elizabeth Beasleys? There just can't be one. There has to be many others. So I went to the British Library in London, the most wonderful place in the world. And I took a look at the Company of Clockmakers, the Register of Apprentices between 1631 and 1931. So this is England and Scotland and Wales. And I'm sorry about the quality of the pictures that I've taken, but these are just a couple examples of hundreds of women who I have found to have apprenticed with the Company of Clockmakers during the time. Now, what's interesting is that sometimes a woman will apprentice with a man, say a father, an uncle. Sometimes a man will apprentice to a woman master. So in this case, the woman is the teacher, she's the master. In those cases, I found that the woman is often a widow. She's often a widow of a man who was a watchmaker and who apparently passed away, and therefore she was legally able to train apprentices after his death. There are also women that are apprenticed to men and women. You see number 3, this Ruth Smith was apprenticed in 1674 to Thomas Birch and Jane, his wife, to learn the art the said Jane useth. We don't know what Jane's expertise was, but we do know that in this case, you know, you can learn watchmaking from a couple, apparently. So anyways, I found that this is extraordinarily interesting and just comes to show that, well, there were indeed young women that were apprenticing, young and women wives, also widows, that were masters, who were masters in the art of clockmaking in whatever kind of specialty. And this really requires a lot more research, and that's kind of what I'm painstakingly up to these days. If you would give us the next slide, we come back to the United States. Here we are. This is such a wonderful, such a wonderful, what's it called, an image. And so these are the women of the Waltham Watch Factory. And so these are the ladies that I have really looked at, especially during my research. If you would show us the next slide, you'd also, so these are the pieces that they were making. The women were divided into different departments. So I think what you have to keep in mind also is that things are not stable within the Waltham Watch Company, you know, is quite volatile, meaning that, but at the beginning, women would be excluded from certain departments. They would be excluded from finishing, say. And little by little, because of economic necessity, managers would, you know, they would ask the men to leave. Men would be made redundant because they're more expensive, and women would kind of edge into fields and departments in which they were hitherto excluded. So you have to realize that, you know, in which departments did women work? Well, it depends on the time, and throughout history, they kind of they spread basically throughout the factory. If we could have the next slide, please. So on the right, you have the Waltham Watch Company, and on the left, you have Les Longines. There is an image of Les Longines at more or less the same. So these are more or less taken at the same time. What I find interesting in this picture, and you know, if you think back to the previous picture of the women at Waltham, look at their style of dress. You know, if you look at their style of dress, and historians of fashion have commented on this as well, women in watchmaking, and men also to a certain degree, they did not dress like other factory workers at the time. The work was obviously, you know, undertaken in a very clean environment. You can't have dust, you can't have dirt when you're working with small micromechanical pieces. And you're also sitting down. In most departments, this is not hazardous work. It's not heavy toil. So people actually dress with a lot of gentility. And we're going to come back to the style of dress as well. But you have women with these kind of rather beautiful brooches and rings on their fingers. And this was rather unusual at the time, say. If we could have the next one. This is a very special picture because this is actually one of the very few photographs we have of the women of the Lancashire Watch Company. So this company was created, I believe, in the 1880s. So like I said, the Swiss were extremely successful on a global scale at Les Longines in the 19th century. Waltham came and became their big rivals. So there's a big rivalry going on between Longines and Waltham. But the English, you know, the English are still trying to hold on because in fact, in the 18th century, the 100 years before that, the best watches in the world were actually made by England. And people don't remember that, but they were the best pieces, the most sophisticated timepieces were made by the British. But by this time, you know, they had unlike the Americans and the Swiss, there was a real reticence to mechanize. And that's a whole, I can talk about that at length, you know, later on, but the British were Luddites in a certain sense. You know, the watchmakers didn't understand the appeal, and they didn't understand the usefulness of really mechanizing their production like the Americans and the Swiss, and therefore this was doomed to failure. I believe the Lancashire Watch Company kind of, you know, with lots of difficulty produced watches, and for about 20-30 years, and they went under very, very quickly. But you know, you see women at work here as well. If you'd give us the next slide, please. Here we have, I always include this slide because, like I said, there are, we're talking about subaltern characters in watchmaking history that aren't really talked about. Perhaps, there is one facet to this story that people are actually quite, the general public is aware of, and that would be the story of the Radium Girls, right? So they're not watchmakers in the strictest sense. Say they did not work at Waltham but these were, and I'm sure you know the story, these were young women who were employed at this, at the company that, and their job was to paint watch dials. So they painted watch dials with radium, and they were terribly radiated, and as a result, led a very successful, very strong and vocal kind of what's it called, union activity to demand, health benefits. So this is perhaps a part of, women in watchmaking, kind of broad sense that people would potentially kind of know about. If you could please move to the next slide. Lovely. Now we're getting to I'm getting to my point slowly but surely. We're going to take a look at the women who used to work at the Waltham Watch Company. And like I said, I always talk about their labor, but I also talk about the strikes, the strike activity that they led. So, for example, what were the topics of contestation? What were they disgruntled for any reason, really? Was there any conflict? Was there any tension between the women workers and management, or between the men worker and management, for that matter? And if there was, well, how was this conflict, say, voiced? And once it was voiced, what kind of tactics were used in terms of collective bargaining? And also, to a certain extent, what was the resolution? What happened? And we'll see that the women of Waltham Watch were neither resigned nor passive, and they contested the modalities of their employment, excuse me. And so what I would propose to you right now is that we kind of trace some developments of the history of time in the US. So we've come to the women of Waltham Watch, but I'd kind of like to go back, zoom out a bit, and talk about the history of time in America, and go back to the development and installation of machines used to measure the time, and bells. So if you'll indulge me, I'll just talk very quickly about the history of time keeping in America, and basically how is it that the Waltham Watch Company came to actually exist and came to actually become so important. If you would give us the next slide, please, Wayne, thank you. So you all certainly know that the casting of bells is a tradition that dates back to antiquity in both the East and the West. And in Western Europe, beginning in the 13th century, bells announced the hours and marked occasions. Bells demarcated moments in the arc of individual lives. I'm talking about weddings, namely, and funerals. Bells announced times that are sacred, Sabbaths and other holy holidays, for example. They rang in honor of civic events such as military triumphs or the ascension of rulers. They called to action in moments of emergencies like fires and floods, etc. But bells also rang to indicate the passage of time itself. Curfew bells, hours bells, midsummer bells, the New Year's bells. And the historian Richard Rath commented, I think very adroitly, that bells mediated between smaller social structures and larger identities based on religious belief, town, region, nation, and colonial relations. So in the 1950s, Boston, Salem, and New York state houses did in fact have ringing bells. And gradually the colonies, they accumulated bells, which after church buildings and state houses were the most important civic and religious accoutrements of the period. But, neither the church nor the state had much of a hand in determining the time. That is to say that the actual task of, deciding what time it was, what time to ring the bell, was actually left up to amateur scientists and jewelers and clockmakers. And this is a topic that kind of falls out of today's scope, but if you'd like to know more about that, I highly recommend Alexis McCrossan and her very wonderful book called Marking Modern Time. I think that I wanted to add, a picture of the Liberty Bell for my presentation, and I just put Liberty Bell into the internet, and I found this this advertisement. I think this was an April Fool's Day prank by Taco Bell, and it was published, I believe, in the 80s or 70s. I can't remember, but I thought it was silly, and therefore I included it in the PowerPoint. It caused a stir because there were a lot of people that actually believed this to be true, that Taco Bell had indeed bought the Liberty Bell, and it caused quite an uproar at the time. If we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Now, as communities became too large, dispersed, and too independent to control with audible time signals alone, their members were expected to marshal their own time through the consultation of clocks. Obviously, if you're only depending on a bell to tell the time, well, there's obvious problems with that, in the sense that the bigger the town becomes, there's more bustle, there's more hustle, there's more noise. Towns are noisy places, and you can't necessarily hear the bell chime. So that was a problem. And therefore, people slowly but surely, Americans began accumulating clocks. Now, owing to the modest levels of wealth and the great expense of timepieces, in 1800, less than a fourth of the American population actually owned mechanical timepieces of any sort. Now, the Willard brothers invented the banjo clock in 1790, complete with a simple wooden works, short pendulums, and cabinet. And this was an innovation that transformed the manufacture of and market for domestic clocks in the United States. You see an example, I think. Now, this isn't an early banjo clock. This is a much later model dating from the 1930s, but just to give you an idea of what that looks like if you hadn't seen one before. So by 1820, American clock ownership was widespread. And, if at first Americans acquired clocks to, out of impulses to decorate their homes, later on, they accumulated clocks to actually keep the time. If before 1820, the prohibitive expense of both clocks and watches reinforced their roles as markers of status, their relative sparse distribution undermined their utility. So they were ornaments. They connected their owners to what the cultural historian Michael O'Malley has described as an idealized version of the world we live in. And, but slowly, like I said, clocks, connected as they were to the notions of gentility and refinement, they began to transcend their status as ornaments. And eventually, once a critical mass of Americans had acquired clocks, they began to use them to measure productivity, time labor, and coordinate social interactions. And pocket watches in this context were tools for gathering the time. They acted as conduits between public clocks and timepieces shelved on mantles and hung on walls. So a network of time was emerging in 1820. Wayne, if we, you can just, sorry about that. Yes, no, it's fine. You can show the next slide already. I think they're quite beautiful images that people might want to spend a bit more time on. So, I think that here we come to watches. So we've talked about bells, and then we talked about how So we talked about how bells were ringing the time, say, already as of the 13th century in Europe and in the rest of the world, in Asia certainly as well. And then, you've got your clocks that become widespread in the United States as of 1820s, but they're very unreliable. And it's in the 1860s that there's a real shift in the popularization of timepieces, of actually portable timepieces, portable watches. So according to Amy Glassmeyer, who's a wonderful author, and she's written a wonderful book about the history of watchmaking. It's not very recent, but it's very, very good. I highly recommend it. Amy Glassmeyer has written that a complete reconceptualization of the watch as both a technology and as a consumer product was required. Now, Glassmeyer explains that until the 1860s, good watches were very expensive. And but with innovations in production and design, well-running watches could actually be cheap as of the 1860s. And Americans really embraced these watches. It's not just that they were novelties. They were really, watches became kind of repositories of sentiment and kind of signifiers of success. Having a beautiful watch kind of meant that you had made it in the world. It became that kind of signifier that to a great extent it is today. Think of the Wall Street businessman, financier with his gaudy, golden Rolex. The intense demand for watches during the Civil War provided the Waltham Watch Company with the opportunity to break with market dominance. So the Civil War, was actually an event that allowed Waltham Watch to break into the market that was hitherto dominated by the Swiss. In 1863, the Waltham Watch Company registered an absolutely enormous profit. None of the watches it made were exported at the time. It mastered 38,000 movements at the rate of 150 a day. And by the next year, in 1864, it was producing 250 movements a day. It was extraordinary. And during the Civil War, there were other American competitors, 5 large-ish firms that had tried to break into the market, but they weren't exactly very successful. And there was only one of the companies called Bigelow's Tremont Watch Company. Now, Bigelow's was the only watch company that managed to actually get their watches to the market during the war. And that's the reason, because the other firms were it was just too slow. It was too time consuming to set up the machinery required to make watches in time to actually produce them and to distribute them to soldiers. Do I have another slide? No. So like I said, I think that there's just one thing I want to say about the Civil War that was really wonderful. I think that there's been, there's Alexis McCrossan, who's written about this extensively, but also the historian Cheryl Wells. So both of these historians have written about the significance of the Civil War for the development of American watchmaking, in the sense that the Civil War really accelerated the transformation of Americans, and particularly soldiers, into watch owners. During the Civil War, watches spread through the ranks. Mastering mechanical time was preeminent in the plans, hopes, and efforts of the Union and the Confederacy. Cheryl Wells said that both the Union and the Confederate leadership routinized camps, hospitals, and prisons according to the clock, while also attempting to implement battle plans on clock time. Alexis McCrossan very astutely took a look at the design of Union soldiers' uniforms. Her research suggests that these uniforms actually included a tiny little pocket inside of the hip. And the tiny little pocket was actually sewn inside of there for the purpose of carrying a clock, a little timepiece. So the existence of that pocket in those pants is actually a very interesting way of determining how, how widespread the use of watches had actually become during the Civil War. Now, oh, pardon me. Let's go back to Waltham Watch, because now we've come to the 1860s. We come to the Waltham Watch Company. If you worked for the company, you most likely lived in Waltham. That's not always the case. Recreation was provided by the company, so were boarding houses and sports teams and picnics and whatnot. There was a nursery, and the nursery is quite extraordinary because, from what I understand, this was the first factory creche to ever be proposed in the United States. I have a picture of that creche, and that'll be shown later on. And the Waltham Watch Company, in their different kind of advertisements, you can see how they're really trying to promote the idea of Waltham watches just taking over the world, from the North Pole to Japan to England. I really do love these advertisements, not only kind of touting technological superiority, but also somehow, it's the adventurers, it's the explorer's watch, it's the accurate watch. If you would give us the next slide, please. Thank you. This is the creche that I was talking about, the day nursery. I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. So what's interesting also about, when I told you about there being the expo, the exhibition at the World's Fair, where there were these workers that were lined up and kind of showing off their expertise when the visitors could watch them. Well, 18 workers were dispatched to that assembly line at the expedition in Philadelphia. And of the 18 workers, 13 of them were women. And visitors to the Centennial, they were quite taken aback, apparently, by the presence of women. And there's one publication called Bricktop Stories, and there was apparently a journalist that was at the Philadelphia World's Fair at the time. He was looking at the women of Waltham working, and he wrote this. He wrote, "There are pretty girls at work, making every part of a watch and keeping jealous wives on the watch, as their husbands suddenly become interested in the wonderful mechanical manipulation of that delicate machinery and those deft fingers. This alone is worth going 1,000 miles to see." So interestingly enough, you've got these journalists that are at the exhibition that are looking at these women working, and they kind of think, this is interesting. There's women's factory labor, but there's also femininity, because these women are said to be pretty. Women that were working for Waltham Watch are presented as a surprise and a curiosity, and the words wonderful and delicate are used, and these aren't usually words that are used in association with factory work. The factory women are described as pretty, mesmerizing even. Factory labor and attractiveness are apparently mutually enforcing in this journalist size. The Waltham Watch Company hired a workforce of 1,000 in 1876, and 40% of that were actually women. The company also had a documented policy of equal work for equal pay, but this was not rigidly observed, let's say, and we can go back into that a little bit more later on. I'm taking a bit more time than I thought I would, but and I think that in order to move on a bit more swiftly, oh yes, let's move on to the next slides, please. I'm going to be wrapping up right now and talking about the strikes. So, like I said, at Waltham Watch, labor was divided into approximately 25 departments. Labor is organized according to gender, with women enjoying more or less access to work, depending on the department. So women are mostly excluded from managerial positions during the period under investigation. So the long period that I've been looking at, with maybe perhaps one exception, one notable exception is Adelaide Clark. Now, Adelaide Clark rose to the rank of 4 women as of 1888. Incoming female workers, they received on-the-job training over the course of the first 6 months of employment. That could be 3 months, even less. It depended on the department. It depended on what they did. In 1876, so the year of the centennial, management looked very favorably upon female labor, which promised to resolve the problem of industrial competition by reducing production costs. But in parallel, increasing scrutiny of industrial life in centers such as New England problematized the factory system's effect on workers' physical, mental, and moral integrity, with female operatives deemed particularly vulnerable. So what I'm trying to say is the factory wanted women, because they were cheap. But on the other hand, they thought, oh, we don't want to appear as though we're somehow contributing to the moral decline of the women's working class. So the firm seized upon the press to present the shop floor as an extension of the family parlor, or the natural milieu of female gentility. So we've got an excerpt from 1866 from the Boston Daily Advertiser that I'd like to read. You see that the female operatives are not at all like the traditional factory girls. They are young ladies. Their appearance, their dress, their manners, and if you speak to them, their language, show that they are educated American women. I noticed that several of them had bejeweled fingers. Men and women work side by side in some rooms. In some rooms, however, there are none but men, and in others there are few but women. Daintily, and in their dainty attire, they do their dainty work, and with the daintiest skill. So the writing depicts female operatives as young women possessing the outwardly attributes of upper-class womanhood. Reference to bejeweled fingers emphasizes the unstrenuous nature of machine-aided female labor, and their style of dress draws attention to the perceived cleanliness and ease with which machine tool operation is said to be carried out. And in this very quaint depiction of factory life, machine tools are the safeguards of female gentility. Gendered occupational segregation is said to establish a sense of propriety and hierarchy that structures relationships between the sexes on the shop floor. We have another excerpt on the next slide, if you will, Wayne, thank you, that reads, pardon me, the factory's rooms are light and cheery like parlors rather than the old close foul quarters of operatives. 750 employees, 1/3 are women. They do their work requiring lightness of touch, quickness, patience. In these qualities, they excel men. In accuracy and precision, they equal them. In ingenuity, they fall below. When out of routine, one is posed by some new mechanical obstacle, her tendency is not to overcome it by herself, but to take the refractory piece of steel or brass or jewel to the bench of the nearest masculine neighbor and ask his help. It's interesting, I think, that there's a mention of the so-called natural predisposition of women for lightness of touch and quickness and patience that are said to be used for industrial use. And in establishing a supposed intellectual dependency on females vis-a-vis male operatives, again, the hierarchy, the gender hierarchy is preserved, say. So very quickly, I just also want to mention that, like I said, men and women at the Waltham Watch Factory were certainly not paid. Well, they were not employed in all jobs equally. The company had a bias as to what work the women should do and where they were best suited. Would you please give us the next slide? Thank you. Oh, but we're not there yet. Yeah, and I just wanted to also say that, coming to the end here. Yeah, for example, also it's interesting that women of the Waltham Watch Company are noted as never asking to work overtime, more likely management would not allow them to work overtime, as this was something that was reserved for men. And also, you know, there was that, I'm sorry. And so now I'm going to come to the strikes very quickly, just to round up and to end up. So as of the mid-1880s, the American watchmaking industry entered a recession. Industrial competition, both domestic and foreign, brought the firm to reduce its cost by resorting to the manufacture of cheaper, plainer grade of watches. And now, in 1889, the time of this newspaper publication, there's a very serious strike that threatened to disrupt production at Waltham Watch. Now, according to the Boston Herald, male strikers opposed to management's strategic attempts to reverse its gender occupational segregation policy is the cause. Here, basically what's happening is that men are striking because apparently women are taking over their work. So it's a real gender conflict here. A strike of serious proportion is said to be brewing at the Waltham Watch Company. It appears that the finishers of the watches has lately been given over largely to girls. Just for some context, finishing is kind of the final stage of watchmaking at the Waltham Watch Company, and it is one of the most prestigious parts of work. It's one of the most best paid departments, and kind of said to be the department that requires the most expertise. The girls are inexperienced, and it has been clearly demonstrated that they cannot do the work. Formerly, men finishers were engaged who were supposed to be competent watchmakers. Since the girls have undertaken the work, men have been constantly employed in repairing the defects, etc., etc. So this strike was averted following management's promise that no more women would be put upon that work. But very soon after, there's going to be a second mass strike that is going to threaten the watchworks. This time it's not the finishing department, it's the jeweling department that is on strike. And again, this is a male-led strike, but really the question is all about female labor. If you would show us the next slide, please, Wayne. Thank you so much. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So this is, oh, and I'm sorry, in 1897 is the second large strike that happened. And so what are we told here? The finishers are the highest paid workmen in the business. And as the art is somewhat of a secret, the men had agreed that the trade should not be taught to women. The finishers were notified that the company intends to have the watches finished by the girls in the future, and this would be a much cheaper method. It is understood that that for some time past, the girls have been working in secret on this particular class of labor. Several of the finishers have given up hope of ever getting back into the factory and intend to seek work elsewhere. They believe that their discharge is permanent. So this is also a very interesting case, and like I only mentioned, I think 2 or 3 of the strike, of large scale strike events that happened at the Waltham Watch Company in the second 19th century, but there were more, and they were more well into the 20th century as well, I'm sorry. And like I said, a lot of these strikes had to do with fairness, with men being able to do what was perceived as men's work, and women being kind of limited to doing what was called women's work. But those definitions shifted so much. Those definitions were so porous, and basically management would have women, take over male dominated departments if it was cheap and if it was convenient. So I think that working on these females workers, these strikes is extremely interesting. Also note that there have been strikes that were led by women, and those were very severe. The strikes led by women were so important, as a matter of fact. I believe this was in the 1890s that they were averted. I mean, management just caved quite immediately. Because there were so many women going out, basically, that you had easily half of your workforce that was just leaving the departments. I think that it would also, be interesting to, as one last thing that I'd like to say, approaching history from this gendered perspective, from the perspective of lives of girls and women, really has the potential to bring light the agency that's wielded by young women to determine not only their fate, but the fate of their families, the family economies. And also, how did women, not only how did industrialization shape the lives of women, but how did women actually shape the fate of American industrialization? So I would ask Wayne to show us the last slide, and this is just the first slide again. And like I said, if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to contact me.